All right, welcome everyone to another session of our Philosophy Matters series. And our speaker today is Renee Conroy, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy here at Purdue Northwest, one of the world's leading scholars of aesthetics. And her topic today deals with that, city spaces and the aesthetics of grit. And I think having said that, Renee, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, David. So I'm going to give just a little bit of background before I dive into the presentation today. It's unusual, I think, for many of us who've been writing in a field for a while to be given explicit assignments. And I'd actually forgotten what it's like if someone tells you, you have to write about something very particular. So to all of my students out there, I feel ya, and I'm sorry. I know I've been doing it to you all semester long. In this particular case, I was invited to contribute an article to an anthology that's coming out this coming year from Routledge on the aesthetics of perfection and imperfection. So I already had one guiding requirement, and that is I had to talk about aesthetic perfection and imperfection in some way. And to be honest, I hadn't thought about either of those topics, and there's not a lot of literature that deals with them in a kind of broad or general theoretical sense. But things got a little bit trickier because a few years ago, I wrote an article on Rust Belt ruins, and people thought somehow this may be an expert on urban spaces, which it does not, though I like urban spaces a lot. So the assignment was, you're going to write a piece of sort of X amount of words on the aesthetics of perfection and imperfection in urban environments. And also you have some ridiculously short period of time in which to complete it. So this was an unusual thing for me because often I write on philosophy of dance, and so I have a lot of background information at my fingertips. I kind of know what I might want to talk about. In this case, I had no idea, and I said to the editor, well, give me about a week and let me think. If I can't come up with anything, I'll let you know. And I pondered for a week, and one of the things that emerged for me in connection with another aesthetic property I'm interested in, which is the property of grace, is the corresponding or maybe somehow related, though clearly quite different, property of grit. And I started doing a little online research, and what I discovered was that there were a lot of contemporary urbanists who were writing about urban grit as though it were both an aesthetic value and also an aesthetic imperfection. So I wrote back and said, I think I can come up with a little something on grit. What do you think? The editor said, yes. And so what I'm going to do today is share with you pieces of that forthcoming article, not the entire thing. I am going to read while also showing you images so that you have something to look at and you won't be completely bored. But I'm going to go ahead and read just to make sure that I keep it within about 35 minutes of presentation, so we have plenty of time for discussion. And I'll also give you a heads up that because this is a topic that I hadn't thought about a lot, I'm really intrigued to find out what other people think. So I gave a version of this talk last week for an international conference in Dubrovnik, and have since decided that pretty much everything I say here is wrong. So that's great. That gives me more to write about next time, and I really look forward to your challenging comments that will help me add to the next installation of my reflections on grit as an aesthetic property. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen now and dive on in. So David, is that working appropriately?
Yes, indeed. We can see it.
Okay, and I can be heard fairly clearly?
Yes.
Great. This is not the Dubrovnik Aesthetics Conference, but this is the slide that I use to introduce it, which gives you a sense of the topic that I'll be dealing with today. So, contemporary aesthetic sensibilities welcome the presence of a little bit of grit. 21st century American decorators, for instance, are infatuated with accent headboards and fireplace mantles fashioned from knotty pieces of salvaged barnwood. And interior designers regularly extol the virtues of exposing well-worn brick walls and long hidden structural beams in order to enhance a room's aesthetic interest. It's also become fashionable in large metropolitan areas to create chic lofts and upscale gastropubs by rehabilitating abandoned warehouses and dilapidated factories. The US reclamation craze, as highlighted in popular home improvement shows and the glossy pages of Architectural Digest and Forbes magazine, suggests affinity for the gritty in today's built environments. But what are the aesthetic dimensions of grit? In what might its allure consist? I address these questions by examining several aspects of grit that emerge from broader considerations about what makes a city or a city space perceptually exciting and affectively resonant. My aim is not to attend to the myriad ways grit affects our aesthetic lives, but only to reflect on its capacity to charm. Hence, the modest goal of this investigation is to trace a variety of overlapping conceptual threads that might help explain the modern sentiment that cities and designed urban spaces benefit aesthetically when they display a bit of grit. So the talk is actually going to have 4 parts that correspond to these big picture moments. I'll offer a few aesthetic preliminaries just to get us set up. We'll spend a little bit of time thinking about the nature of aesthetic imperfection and regulative ideals. Then I'll offer a few thoughts about some concepts that will need to be spelled out and distinguished from one another, including grit versus grime. And finally, the positive proposal comes at the end, and this will be an aspective approach to the potential goodness of grit. So, a project of this kind might naturally attend to grittiness as an aesthetic property. Now, although I regard being gritty as akin to descriptors like being graceful, being vibrant, or being vapid, I avoid the language of aesthetic properties because it invites philosophical complication I wish to sideline, focusing instead on the complexities of grit itself. So I refer to grit ecumenically herein as a potential aesthetic concept with an appropriate nod to Frank Sibley, where this just means a description that can be applied meaningfully to a range of things in some aesthetically substantive way. I likewise sidestep complex issues about the nature of the aesthetic, which is often contrasted with the artistic, the historical, or the practical, in favor of a Catholic, which is to say sort of broad interpretation of this interminably vexed term. So on my approach, when a descriptor such as is gritty is used aesthetically, the utterer is merely flagging the presence of at least one of many possible features that tend to count towards something's being regarded as having an aesthetic dimension or rewarding aesthetic attention. And if you have a favorite theory about that, you can insert your theory right there. In the limited context of today's investigation, when the predicate is gritty is used, it functions as an aesthetic description, just in case the utterer aims to draw nuanced attention to the perceptible features of a physical thing, event, or environment, and perhaps to indicate its perceived value or lack thereof as an object of sensory attention. With the proviso that grittiness, like many other potential aesthetic concepts, can be predicated in both purely descriptive and more or less thickly evaluative senses, that skeletal outline will suffice for present purposes. By contrast, much more needs to be said about the idea of aesthetic imperfection before it can be determined whether so-called urban grit is a form of it, as is implied by the opening lines of architect and urban planners Kevin Klinkenberg's essay, Why We Need Messy Cities. And this little quote here is actually the inspiration for the paper and the talk. He writes, years ago, I remember many people using the term gritty as a way to describe places, as in, I like gritty cities, or that place is nice, but it doesn't have enough grit for me. I used it, I identified with it, even in my very careful Midwestern way. Gritty implied some imperfection, and perhaps even some danger that lurked in buildings in the blocks of older cities. My thoughts were not terribly well formed, but gritty somehow seemed right to me. Now, while it might be intuitive to regard being gritty as a prima facie aesthetic imperfection, this is ill-advised. After all, while grit can be a blemish, it can also be a boon, and it's worth considering what makes the difference. So, when do we compliment something by describing it as gritty? And when is this a form of censure? A brief review of paradigmatic examples that are not related to cities may be helpful. Grit in an oyster as Rockefeller, indeed every prepared dish I can think of, is deemed a culinary flaw. Why? because a pebbly mouthfeel typically indicates the presence of something that doesn't belong in the dish, like sand, or a failure to prepare the illicit ingredients appropriately. Likewise, many find a grittily textured kitchen or bathroom countertop a tactile affront because the feel of a grainy or rough surface can imply a lack of cleanliness. So too, grit in a diamond may be disparaged on aesthetic grounds because the visual value of gemstones depends in part on their brilliance and clarity. So these examples illustrate that we don't appraise grit as a negative feature or putative aesthetic imperfection willy-nilly. Instead, in each case, deficiency arises when grit, understood in its purely descriptive sense as some form of perceptible texture, interferes with some other feature that's of primary or overriding aesthetic value. Hence, the grit-filled oyster is evaluated poorly alongside the gritty feeling countertop or the grit-occluded jewel, because oysters are esteemed for their slippery mouthfeel, countertops often valued for their sanitary smoothness and concomitant sheen, and gemstones prized for their luminescence. In each case, grit is regarded as an aesthetic demerit, with a nod there to Eugene Schlossberger, insofar as it counts against the aesthetic value of the whole. There are, however, familiar cases in which some form of grit is not only desirable, but actively sought because it's regarded as an aesthetic enhancement. Quentin Tarantino refuses to shoot films digitally, finding celluloid aesthetically superior in both image resolution and richness. However, he also regularly exploits the grit factor of older celluloid film types, such as 35mm monochrome or Super 8, in order to tell his visual stories more effectively. He does this, for instance, in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in which a variety of analog formats are used both to recreate the look of 1950s and 60s television shows and to enhance realism in the sequences representing life at the home of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski prior to the Manson murders. Similarly, many of the bronze figures in the Musée Rodin Sculpture Garden are palpably and visibly gritty in virtue of affective realism. Their rough surfaces enhance their eeriness and their angst. Hence, ragged texture is expressively apt for the burghers of Calais, which is at the top here, and Ugolino and his sons at the bottom. And this is because Auguste Rodin's artistic aims for these works are to create a kind of affective realism that is complemented by visual grain, just as film grain complements the disturbingly raw narrative worlds created by Tarantino. Now, it's also become popular to download free photo editing applications to add a granular, over-processed look to selfies and other digital photographs in pursuit of visible grit. One writer explains, quote, "There's just something about film grain that gives portrait photographs an ethereal, almost dreamlike aesthetic. In addition, it also provides emulated retro appeal." So in all these cases, the Tarantino film, the Rodin bronze, and the millennials' Instagram post, a bit of visual grittiness is purported to add aesthetic value by making the object of attention startlingly realistic, yet also almost dreamlike, thereby producing an affectively compelling representation that trades self-consciously in a mixture of truth and falsity, actively blurring the lines between the two to poignant emotional ends. Now, this brief review of non-urban examples reminds us that, as with many other potential aesthetic concepts, the aesthetic valence of anything appropriately described as gritty invariably depends on context, as well as the way details resonate within a given context. For this reason, it would be a mistake to regard grittiness as a prima facie aesthetic flaw, despite the intuitive force of Klinkenberg's claim that, with respect to cities anyway, being gritty implied some imperfection. But another reason to be wary of branding grit as a prima facie aesthetic flaw turns on the difficulty of articulating a sufficiently general, yet conceptually illuminating account of aesthetic deficiency. So, imperfection typically denotes a lack of perfection, a failure to meet some recognized ideal. In the perceptual realm, it's most apt to regard perfection in terms of a paradigm that captures some more or less determinate standard for success in a particular domain. Thus, the perfect token dachshund is simply the most excellent exemplar of a specific canine type, where the relevant good-making features are established by organizations like the Kennel Club. And the perfect souffle is one that exemplifies to the utmost degree those characteristics deemed by reputed chefs to be valuable in this particular kind of dessert, such as airiness, creaminess, and subtlety of flavor. Now, in the art world, there are a miscellany of regulative ideals to which one might appeal to justify the claim that a candidate for appreciation possesses an imperfection or some kind of flaw. Aesthetic perfection is associated traditionally with physical proportion or perceived harmony. As a result, mathematical considerations are often claimed, somewhat controversially, to have been of great importance to the ancient Greeks and their Renaissance counterparts in the creation and estimation of the visual arts, including architecture. Whatever might be true of our creative forebears' actual appeal to formula like Phidias's golden ratio, which is represented here both in a sort of ancient architectural form showing how the ratio works out to capture its dimensions, and then also with respect to one of the most famous Renaissance artworks, again showing how it exemplifies mathematical proportions of this particular ratio. Now, but whether our forebears actually appealed to this thing or not, classical and neoclassical artistic standards undeniably favor the appearance of balance and symmetry and countenance perceptual dissonance as a kind of failing. By contrast, in the performing arts, one canonical measure of perfection is compliance with a score or a script. A presentation that deviates from the relevant set of instructions might be regarded as containing a defect. And here's an example of a script where someone's working on the relevant set of instructions. This turns out to be important in a minute. This is actually Schoenberg's markings on his or several of Bach's Goldberg variations, which he's quite famous for playing, but a little bit more loosely than some other people. And moving further along in the aesthetic realm, in the domain of museum curation or art restoration, a central concern is with perfection in condition, so that attenuation of original details or materials on a canvas or sculpture or other artistic artifact might be assessed as a serious aesthetic demerit. Now, regulative ideals such as proportion, compliance, or condition are as common in art circles as they are varied. However, they're not only defeasible, but regularly defeated. For example, it's widely agreed that a note-by-note execution of a musical composition doesn't necessarily produce a desirable performance of the composer's work. Indeed, slavishly following a score is often deemed an aesthetic blemish in itself, especially when it results in a mechanical or emotionally weak presentation. Thus, some music lovers passionately prefer Glenn Gould's quite unorthodox interpretation of Bach's Goldberg variations over Van Cliburn's much more precise treatment. Moreover, achieving or maintaining perfect proportion or condition can often be argued to detract from the overall interest or the aesthetic value of a painting or sculpture. Consider the power of distortion harnessed in classic Cubist and Surrealist works, and the heated debates over the aesthetic value of restoring the Sistine Chapel's frescoes to their original hues. But more importantly, in some artistic contexts, there's a regulative ideal that prizes imperfection. This is particularly true in improvisatory performing arts, where recovery from and discovery as a result of some misstep or mishap is regarded as an accomplishment in itself and is valued for its capacity to stimulate creativity, bring life to a performance, and sustain appreciative interest. Andy Hamilton develops a positive sense of perfection, reconceiving the aesthetics of imperfection as a, quote, open, spontaneous response to contingencies of performance or production, one that aims to create something positive from apparently unpromising as well as promising circumstances. Hence, on his account, imperfection is a constant striving for new contingencies to respond to. Now, Hamilton explicitly addresses the risks and rewards inherent in live performances, including music, theater, dance, performance art, and I presume stand-up comedy. But his rejecting imperfection as a kind of flaw and recasting it as an ideal in the pursuit of new challenges to be wrestled with in real time can also be applied to the visual arts and the processes they embody. Now, if Hamilton's analysis is apt, then there seem to be cases in which it's appropriate to describe an artistic offering or creation as perfectly imperfect. This form of praise applies, I'll submit, when something that would be regarded as a flaw under some art-relevant standard of perfection, such as one that prizes proportion or compliance or condition, or some other genre-specific norm, is transformed from a putative defect into a new source of aesthetic value. And though the phrase smacks of paradox, the notion of the perfectly imperfect is familiar in both artistic and non-artistic aesthetic contexts. For instance, Hamilton notes the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi invites object-specific appreciation. Acceptance, aging, a mark on a bowl enhances its value. Apply this idea to a hypothetical case. The perfection acquired by a newly cracked vase might be thought to consist in its emblematic accuracy and potency. Now blemished, the vessel becomes an apt symbol for our lives, rife with flaws and cracks in character or resolve. While the artifact was once an example of vase-relevant physical perfection, in developing a fissure through accident or the passage of time, it's taken on a new form of value that can be grasped and savored in sensory encounters. And whereas its erstwhile seamlessness was pleasingly manufactured artifice, the visible fracture highlights the ornament's natural fragility. In short, the vase on the crack is revealing. It tells the truth, in some sense, about the vase, and by metaphorical extension, about us. As a result, the artifact's perceptible imperfection arguably transforms it into something new, a perfect emblem. Now, a similar point can be made about imperfections in nature, the weeds in my garden, the blight on the rose, the charred remains of what were once lush California forests. All speak to what is real, if unpleasant to behold. Thus, all can be instances of the quote, perfectly imperfect, insofar as all can serve as potent symbols of the natural degradation that attends every form of life and is an essential part of its ongoing cycles of birth, death, and renewal. Now, in art world contexts, Hamilton's regulative ideal of imperfection must be more complex. First of all, it involves striving, an intentional activity inappropriate to describe nature's processes or the life cycle of inanimate objects like bowls or vases. Second, as is well articulated in Lee Brown's plea for imperfection, and this is a part of the title of a famous article of his, in Jazz Performance, the regulative ideals that govern any specific genre are multiple, and they may be in tension with one another. As Brown notes, it's not that the formalist is just wrong in complaining that jazz music is flawed insofar as it's disordered, chaotically, and musically confused, while also being formulaic, banal, and oversimple. The values he profiles are values we all prize. However, those values are systematically compromised by other aspects of the music, which are no less interesting. The implication is that a performance will be better in the dimensions that matter to jazz appreciators if punctuated by missed notes, reconceived as opportunities to develop a new melodic line, or melodic mistakes that are repeated and modulated to become novel phrasing motifs. Brown acknowledges that the more ambitious the performance in pursuing and resolving putative imperfections, the more likely it is to be messy. But this kind of mess, which might sound to the uninitiated like musical mayhem or a simple lack of technical skill, is the vibrance of jazz for those who love it. It's what makes that genre exciting. So here, it's useful to consider Klinkenberg's claim that to get back to building and rebuilding the kinds of places we love most, we have to start embracing the messy, unpredictable, and uncomfortable, always changing nature of life. That's what gives us grit in a good way. And I'll just make a quick note about the images on the bottom of the slide here. This is part of an ongoing international project in which you're all invited to contribute. It started as kind of an artwork installation and has become an artwork game. It began in about 2010, I believe, by an artist from Berlin named Jan Vorman, and it's called Dispatch Work. You can look it up online. And it's an opportunity for people to take parts of the cities in which they live that may be exemplifying grit because they have missing tuck pointing or missing bricks, things are falling apart, and to add vibrance by reconsidering the space, filling it in with Legos. So if you can find some spaces in your hometown that invite this, you're welcome to contribute to this. Okay, next part. Embracing the conceptual nitty-gritty. And actually, I'm going to go back to the slide for just a second. So I haven't really talked much about cities yet. How can examples of non-urban grit and the concept of aesthetic imperfection help us resolve an apparent tension between two ideas defended regularly by contemporary urbanists? On the one hand, that grit contributes to the aesthetic allure of a city environment, and on the other, that it's some kind of imperfection. First, in artistic milieu, the notion of imperfection is ineluctably complex, given the great variety of often competing measures of so-called perfection, as we've already seen. And in broader aesthetic contexts, including urban environments, we are much less constrained by regulative ideals that pertain to purely perceptual features. Instead, such cases typically foreground standards related to other kinds of concerns, like economic or political health. Therefore, we should expect any treatment of aesthetic imperfection that goes beyond a museum or a symphony hall to be even more diverse and even less decisive than the conceptually messy accounts that will be needed to illuminate the intricacies of perfection and imperfection in the art world. Now, second, it's unclear what kind of aesthetically relevant regulative ideals could be active in Klinkenberg's suggestion that gritty implied some imperfection. For when we move from forms of perfection in an artistic or an artificially structured aesthetic context, like a dog show or haute cuisine, to everyday environment, like a city, there just are no pre-established measures of aesthetic success. Identifying suitable regulative ideals will always be tricky because cities are neither natural nor wholly designed. Urban settings, instead, are a blend of ever-evolving artifact and accident, and our lives in them are quite literally unscripted. Arnold Berlion underscores this reality profitably by suggesting we can even extend the artistic metaphor to think of urban life as a complex improvisational theater in which the dramas of human life constitute the plot lines. Humans are thus both the creative artists, the actors, and the participatory audience in an environmental drama. Now, it's also important to acknowledge that the development of cityscapes always involves an improvisatory element that outstrips the arduous work of city planners and conscientious architects, the putative counterexample of Brasilia notwithstanding. Despite the premeditation of councils, planning boards, civil engineers, and others, cities are simply more like forests than Ford Fairlanes. They grow organically over time in unexpected ways, rather than coming off the assembly line fully formed, crafted dutifully to meet the specifications of some comprehensive plan. They flourish, founder, and sometimes go up in flames, as was literally true of Chicago, Illinois, which, like a phoenix rising from the urban ashes, was extemporaneously rebuilt to establish itself as a new city after the Great Fire of 1871. As a result, applying any aesthetic standard that appeals to something like compliance with a blueprint or a set of instructions seems woefully misguided. Furthermore, cities aren't simply organized complexes of buildings punctuated by cultivated nature in the forms of parks and arboreta. As Berlion indicates, they're constituted in the main by people and the wild contingency of their lives' projects, as these are undertaken shoulder to shoulder in a specific locale. Hence, it's also unwise to attempt to assess the putative imperfection of a city by appeal to any aesthetic standard like those that esteem mathematical proportion or preservation of original condition. How could anything like such ideals usefully apply when it is the thrill of constant imbalance and the thrall of relentless development that is the hallmark of metropolitan life. So where should we go from here? Well, one profitable strategy might be to tease grit apart from closely associated aesthetic concepts and consider dimensions in which grit can be or signify something of value. So first, we ought not conflate grit with other common features of cities, such as grime, crime, or debris. To say of a city that it is gritty is not to say that it suffers from urban blight or should be regarded as an industrial ruin. While Rust Belt ruins, for example, may have aesthetically compelling dimensions, these are a product of dereliction and disquietingly swift decay. That is, urban ruins are special places in which grit has become squalor at an alarming rate, bringing danger along with it. As such, their aesthetic potential consists in eliciting the twin affects of the dynamical sublime, or so I have argued, while also providing opportunities to explore what philosopher Carolyn Korsmeyer calls the sublate. Grit, by contrast, does not typically evoke the negative absorption that attends the disgusting, nor the Burkean distress prompted by overwhelmingly hostile forces. While calling an urban area gritty can bespeak a negative emotional response, it needn't. And when it does, the level of discomfort elicited by urban grit is far below the affective recoil generated by encounters with modern ruins, given the many ways the latter legitimately provoke both fear and disgust. So second, there are substantive differences between grit and other features of cities often associated with it. Grit, as a textural quality of places and spaces, is typically the result of erosion. Cracked foundations, missing tuck pointing, peeling paint, ripped canopies, and threadbare theater seats. All of these emerge from regular conditions of use in an urban environment in which weather, pollution, animal life, and active citizens all take a toll on buildings, streets, and other utilitarian artifacts. Thus, grit, like the crack in the vase, is revealing. It opens up illuminatively the spaces we inhabit and the objects that we use, without compromising their basic structure or rendering them unfit for purpose. By contrast, grime occludes. Grit is the product of a force wearing down a surface, adding a not unhealthy but perceptually obvious granularity. Grime, by contrast, is the accumulation of unhealthy elements like dirt, soot, or asbestos. As a result, the grittiness of a historic building that has not undergone a complete restoration may diminish the glory of some of its original aesthetic qualities, but nonetheless contribute to other features of compensating value, such as what people like to call an aura of authenticity. But the presence of grime on old lead glass windows, handmade corbels, and carefully crafted decorative details actively prevents us from seeing these things clearly, if they can be made out at all. Thus, grime rarely, if ever, contributes to a new dimension of aesthetic value. Similarly, while grit clarifies our perception of what's been there all along, lurking beneath the surface appearance of the blocks we walk and the buildings in which our lives unfold, debris or rubbish clutters our view. Piles of trash, as encountered in a Rust Belt ruin, might have aesthetic allure. They could be formally interesting, afford an opportunity to touch what Korsmeyer calls the genuine, or generate the dismay that elicits the sublime through overwhelming quality, quantity, or pungent smell. But the aesthetic interest of grit is not simply a matter of how it presents itself to us in a sensory encounter. It's rather, I submit, a product of how perceived grit resonates with us over time, calling our attention to non-perceptual properties of urban environments that reflect their history and invite us to reflect on our own. So now finally to the positive account, which thankfully is fairly brief, so we're getting close to the end. As noted previously, grit's not always a positive aesthetic quality in urban environments. Sometimes the predicate is gritty conveys disappointment or disdain. But when grit is regarded as contributing to the aesthetic appeal of an old-style jazz club or a long-standing urban neighborhood, this is typically because its formal features are of interest in themselves. Furthermore, the perceptual magnetism of these traits can be enriched by meditation on their history and augmented by associations with moral virtue. I sketch three possible aspects of urban grit's aesthetic allure that I submit work together to explain how having an element of grit can be an aesthetic benefit. So here's the first dimension. In its purely descriptive sense, is gritty denotes marked texture. A material object exemplifies grit when its surface is perceptibly uneven or layered. So too, a singer's voice is described as gritty when it possesses an identifiable sonic feature of being raspy or gravelly. And a photograph or film clip is deemed to be gritty when it exhibits grain or inconsistent exposure. The point is that in each of these cases, we see, feel, or hear the grit without expending much effort to grasp it. Things tend to wear their grittiness on their perceptual sleeve, as it were. So when grit is counted as a good-making feature in aesthetic context, it's often on formalist grounds. Visual texture in a painting or assemblage provides viewing diversity, sustaining interest. It causes us to savor an art canvas's sensory features, such as daubs of paint, or to explore layers of the media to apprehend complexities and unexpected interrelations between them. City grit affords similar opportunities to dwell on irregularities and to peel back the layers of visual experience. We can savor the chaos of the cracks in the city sidewalk or the cement waves made by unseen roots of overgrown trees. We might relish the vibrant inconsistencies of line, hue, and visible texture in damaged fascia or crumbling brickwork. And the colorful strata found on graffiti walls and electric poles displaying ripped flyers and fading advertisements, punctuated by half-rusted staples, may come to entrance our senses like a Jasper Johns assemblage. So let's call this dimension the perceptual presence of urban grit. Now, when we confront the textural qualities of an environment whose formal complexity is a product of erosive forces, we have a chance to pause and ponder the causal histories of the objects or spaces we find texturally compelling. In such moments of reflection, our immediate interest in the look, feel, and sound of the thing gives way to contemplation of its sources. We may be enticed to imagine the stories of life, the particular nicks, scratches, cracks, pockmarks, and the patina of posters and spray paint tell. Sometimes, as in the underground tour in Pioneer Square here in Seattle, a local historian can provide these narratives. But often we cannot even hazard an educated guess about where the grit that holds our attention came from. For this reason, confrontation with grit's historical aspect is not, I submit, properly regarded as epistemic in nature. Instead, it moves us from immediate sensory experience of surface textures to imaginative rumination on the texture of time. This shift in attention is not generally conscious, nor is it required for a positive aesthetic encounter with a bit of city grit. It engages us, however, in a more reflective form of appreciation, focused on the ways in which urban erosion can be revealing. We're drawn back with new eyes to the gashes, the tears, and the holes in a building or an object when we see these as visible markers of its past. And because we recognize that that which is now gritty may be a shadow of its former aesthetic self, we're also inspired to imagine how it was in its heyday. Furthermore, when the object of attention is partially stripped for closer inspection, we may revere the labor and the craftsmanship that went into its production. Attending to the inner details of constituent materials often gives us insight into how they were fashioned and enables us to appreciate the effort involved to structure them into a functional, perhaps even originally beautiful, urban entity. This invites us to envision the space and its elements as part of a distinctive human narrative, one that, like our own life story, is always in danger of fading into obscurity in the hustle and bustle of modernity. So let's call this dimension the historical resonance of urban grit. Now, if we begin to construct descriptive backstories about the gritty objects and the places we survey, we just can't help but think of those who've gone before. And this leads naturally to imaginings about what kind of people they might have been, given the grit-based evidence at hand. And it's common for these narratives we conjure to involve plot lines or character sketches that foreground grit in its ethical rather than aesthetic sense. Oops. Let's go back. As Angela Duckworth's New York Times bestseller, The Power of Passion and Perseverance attests, there's a substantive philosophical tradition from Aristotle to William James. There it is. No, here it is. that identifies persistence, pluck, or tenacity in the face of adversity or challenge as a moral virtue. The gritty person's not afraid of long hours, suffering reverses, and expending great physical and emotional resources in pursuit of building better tools, better spaces, better lives. People with grit have the resolve to persist through the hard times, but the character they exhibit is not a trait of raw obstinance, nor is it mere or blind zeal. Instead, it involves the accepting attitude, highlighted by Andy Hamilton's positive sense of imperfection as a, quote, open, spontaneous response to the contingencies of performance and production, one that aims to create something positive from apparently promising and unpromising circumstances. That is, grit is a moral disposition to continue striving in the face of both recognized opportunities and unexpected challenges. And when we confront urban grit, the inner materials that constitute familiar places are partially exposed to us, affording us a chance to look into them as evidence of patient handiwork, and also through them as icons or emblems of perseverance and passion. Here we may be reminded that, as urbanist Gillian Glover notes, a city's grit comes from its people's struggles, the new immigrant taking a night shift cleaning office buildings to make it in a new world, or the artist eking out a living, making art in an abandoned warehouse. Thus, the gritty building or the gritty city block can, like the vase, be transformed into an emblem. It can become an apt and powerful symbol of a virtuous character trait that we prize in every walk of life, independent of whether one's aims are pursued in a city or a pastoral farming community. Let's call this the ethical aspect of grit. My closing suggestion is simple. The aesthetic allure of urban grit is oscillatory. And just to make sense of the slide we have here, this is actually a magazine that is created by the city of Tacoma, which not really originally to its great happiness, has been now termed officially Grit City. And so in response to being called Grit City in a way they didn't like, they created this sort of Grit City magazine. And this is the sort of opening pages of the magazine where they just sort of define how they're thinking of grit and why they now think of it as a kind of positive reflection on the city rather than a sort of suggestion that it's just a center of urban blight or devastation. And though I'm not going to read the quote that's up here, what I'm suggesting is that everything that they have that I've highlighted in yellow is an aspect of this sort of oscillatory cycle that I'm exploring with respect to the aesthetics of grit. So the aesthetic allure of urban grit is oscillatory or cyclical. It consists in aspective movement. The grit engenders as we go from its perceptual presence to its historical resonances, to possible erudite associations, and then back again. Some aesthetic encounters with grit will be negative, others positive in only the perceptual dimension. But when grit grips us aesthetically, causing us to savor its physical presence and pore over its sensory details, or inspires us, like the urbanists I've mentioned, to claim that a city is better or more worthy of love when it displays grit. This, I suggest, is because grit can give rise to a multidimensional experience that engages the senses, the imagination, and our moral sentiments in repeated succession. Each aspect resonates with the others, allowing urban grit to continually reignite our interest. Thus, the mutual inflection of these three facets of grittiness generates aesthetic complexity that can hold us, or at least inspire us to look again. Nonetheless, and as a closing thought, an encounter with the gritty is a brush with imperfection. Urban grit emerges from physical losses suffered as a result of a city's corrosive forces, be they economic, political, or a product of nature. Thus, the presence of grit typically reflects personal struggles and human failings, both past and present. It also involves the diminishment in perceptible features of building facades, hardwood floors, or city pathways that were designed originally to reward aesthetic attention by fostering illusions of seamlessness or effortlessness, or by exhibiting classical proportions. If, however, aesthetic imperfectionism can be fruitfully regarded, as Hamilton puts it, as a constant striving for new contingencies to respond to, then confronting a little bit of urban grit may afford us the perfect chance to admire others' past acts of aesthetic striving while engaging in new appreciative striving behaviors of our own. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Renee. Let's open it up for questions. And we have a pretty small, reasonably modest group here. So feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up if you have a question at this time, a question or a comment.
And remember, they're worth 5 points.
What was that?
I said, remember, they're worth 5 points if you're one of my students.
Right. So I could ask a question, but I'd rather hear from maybe someone else first if someone else has something.
So I don't so much have a question, more so a comment, but so one of my favorite things about going to a national park or any new place really is getting to look at a building or a structure or just a place in general. And like you talked about, see the evidence of how something was made and the handiwork that went into it. And my best friend, that's our favorite part of, going new places. And we've never really had a word for it, but now I have learned, thankfully, that that's just grit.
Maybe. I mean, this may be
maybe.
But we could start there. So yeah, thank you, Jacob. And actually, I was thinking when you started that you might also find alluring in these contexts another kind of experience that I didn't talk about here, and that there is quite a bit of literature on if you're interested. And that's the aesthetic resonance of ruins, where although you do get to see the insides, and that's kind of interesting, what tends to be most aesthetically compelling in many of the classical accounts is that these are what they call aesthetic hybrids. So you have some piece of artifact that's sort of degenerating as these wonderful bits of nature are growing in and through it, making a new perceptual object that resonates with our attentions in imaginative ways, historical ways, perceptual ways, quite like I've described grit here, except that the nature itself, that component draws a different kind of regard. And so if you're interested, let me know. I can give you some of the resources on just ruins and ruin appreciation. And you may find that's more consistent with what you guys are enjoying when you go out into the wilderness and find an old dilapidated barn that has vines growing on it or something like that.
Thank you.
Are there other questions at this time or comments?
Yes. Would the Tacoma aroma be considered an aspect of grit or grime?
Yeah. Okay. So Nova's spent time in the Pacific Northwest, so she's familiar with Tacoma, which is often regarded as the not as lucky stepchild of Seattle. And that's how it got the name Grit City. There's actually some debate over how specifically it got this name, but originally Tacomans weren't happy with this, so they tried to usurp it and make it a good thing. I've never seen anybody embrace the Tacoma aroma moniker in the same way. So if you go to Tacoma now, you can get t-shirts that say Grit City. That last image that I had up is actually one that you can get at the t-shirts. So people in Tacoma proudly wear these saying, hey, Seattle, you're too gentrified. We're still industrial. We're still gritty. We don't have all of those buildings. And yeah, I guess you can kind of smell what's going on here. But because the residents have never, to my knowledge, embraced that aspect, which I think is really interesting, I suspect they might prefer to think of it in terms that would be closer to something like aromatic grime. But if we could spin it in a positive direction for them, I'm sure they'd be pleased. So I hadn't thought about that, Nova. That's a really good example. And I'll also have to think a little bit more, because it's not overwhelming like when you go into a Rust Belt ruin and it just is like you're thrown back on your heels. But if, for those of you who haven't been there, when you drive through Tacoma, you know you're in Tacoma, right? Is that right, Nova? Do you have a thought about that? What should we do with the Tacoma aroma? I love this question.
Well, since the residents are starting to take a certain pride in the term of it being Grit City, and it's something that you can't ignore it as you're driving down I-5. You know, I would compare it to a scent of canned corn and olives. You know, I feel like maybe it's kind of in between. You know, maybe it's a little more associated with grime, but you know, in imperfection, especially just like the industrial aspects of the area, you know, maybe it could be considered a part of grit or become to be embraced as so.
I think the difficulty I have there too, I mean, I'll just be honest, I didn't really want to write about imperfection in the first place. So I told you in the beginning, this was a framing mechanism I was handed as part of the assignment. And if I ever were to do this, sort of thinking about grit again, I wouldn't talk about imperfection at all, as a matter of fact, because I think it's really hard for me to make sense of any regulative ideal that would tell me why the Tacoma aroma is imperfect, right? What, imperfect relative to the smell of roses? Well, that just seems like the wrong kind of regulative ideal. Imperfect relative to the smell of Seattle? Well, I mean, I guess it depends how traffic is during rush hour that day and if you're behind an exhaust-filled truck. So as one of my colleagues pointed out to me the other day, the whole notion of aesthetic perfection and imperfection has been built up as something that may need just to be dismissed or disassembled. And I think I'd agree with that. So what I'd want to do, Nova, is just try to figure out what role it could play without having to think of it as a flaw or an imperfection. And that might help then fold it into the story. And so you are getting credit in the next version of the article where I talk about Tacoma aroma. Thank you.
I see we have a couple of hands up. I think first is Joseph, please.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks for coming.
No problem. So I just wanted to say I found your presentation very fascinating because I like the part you said about music. Like I'm a musician, and sometimes I'll have people over to make like little scores and stuff, and I might mess up a note, and they're like, no, that's good. And I always like never knew like what that was called, like when you mess up and it actually is like something good. So I found that part really interesting.
As I said to Jacob, in the dimension of thinking about mistakes, if they're rightfully called that, in contexts where there's some improvisatory element, especially in music, not only jazz music, but often jazz music, there's a lot of really interesting philosophical literature on that. And on how we conceive of the concept of a mistake in that context, if it even makes sense. Are you trying to play work that you're creating on the fly, or that allows you some space to riff, or are you trying to do something that you had sort of an antecedent, very clear-cut plan for when this happens with your friends?
No, we're just making it like from our like creativity, just inspiration.
Yeah, so tons and tons of literature on improvisation and the importance of sort of the recovery from. That's usually what we value in those contexts. One of the things we can value, the person's ability to recover from what might have seemed like it would be a mistake, and then to modulate it and turn it into an opportunity. Lots of jazz pianists will say, if you hit a wrong note, right? Because there are, jazz improvisation, unless it's totally free jazz, is much more structured than people have a tendency to think. And so there's a background structure that all of the musicians are using, but so you get a wrong note, right? Well, it's sort of common things, just play it like 12 more times and it becomes right. And so there's a lot of really cool stuff on that. If you're interested, I can send you some links.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Nia, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, but you're next.
Yes. Hi, Professor. So I think it's just to piggyback on, it's more so of a statement and a question, because I took an aesthetics course in high school, and I think it's so cool that, like, looking at society today, that I feel like we're slowly kind of turning from that picturesque, like, utopia, like, oh, look at me and look at all the fakeness, and people are starting to embrace the real. And I would always talk about like authenticity, but now like coming to this lecture I can say, oh, it's grit. And I think it's like based on perspective and finding the beauty in grit. But what kind of grabbed my attention is talking about the Chicago fire. And like the question that I had was like, could you say that you can look at it as nature and grit is like the foundation of what is deemed as beauty, like the beauty standards? Because a lot of people go to Chicago and see the Chicago like tower as like a historical like monument or beauty. And it's like, could you say that like, okay, grit is the foundation of beauty, basically? Like, could we view it as that if we want to dive deeper into it? Because I know that there was the conversation of like the difference between grit and grime, and a lot of people would have that like confusion, and I guess it's based on like perception and how deep you really want to get into it. So I think it's like, could you see it as like grit being the foundation of beauty?
So I love this, Nia. We'd have to have a really long conversation. First of all, so I can hear about your high school aesthetics class, because you might be the first person I've ever heard to get an aesthetics class in high school, which is really awesome. So one of the things you'll notice is I think I maybe used the word beautiful in a qualified way once in a fairly long thing. And there's a reason for that. I avoid the term at all costs. For one thing, in the sort of field of philosophical aesthetics, it's very, very freighted. And in sort of the ways you were suggesting, just as there's a sort of classical conception of beauty and the arts that has to often do with proportions and harmony and balance and symmetry. There are classical conceptions of beauty in the intellectual traditions that, although they don't necessarily highlight exactly those same things, often highlight some of them. Maybe they also talk about things like uniformity amidst variety. And it, over the years, I think has become extremely difficult to use the term without bringing a whole lot of baggage along with you. And in fact, one of the things that seems to have happened in contemporary aesthetics, probably not even that contemporary, somewhere after the 1940s, probably starting in about the 50s and 60s, people just stopped talking about beauty altogether. And they started talking about all kinds of other things in aesthetics and not using the term. And in fact, it was so bad that I have some colleagues who actually wrote a book. One person wrote a book called Beauty Matters back in the late 90s, early 2000s, like, hello, you've forgotten about beauty. We need to revive it. So there's an attempt now to figure out how to do, I think, what you're suggesting. How do we go from a sort of theoretical and aesthetic context that just was beauty-based in a very specific kind of way for hundreds of years, perhaps, to then a history that says, okay, well, that's problematic and freighted, and we want to grow, and we want dissonance, and we want the real or the genuine, however you want to put it. And so we were going to focus on that instead of sort of stereotypical kinds of beauty. And then to the resurgence of the idea that both of those things, there's probably some way to get them going both together. I guess my intuition would be, as in many things, and this is going to be deeply unsatisfying, I'm sorry, there are many kinds of beauty. And also many different ways that philosophers are going to use it in aesthetic context. I wouldn't necessarily say grit is beautiful. The language I use instead is aesthetically captivating, aesthetically alluring, right? It draws you in, it engages you. I think lots of things that are horrible and disgusting and not beautiful at all, and maybe downright ugly, if I had an account of what that was, also are aesthetically engaging in those ways. So, I mean, I have a tendency to talk about beauty just in terms of like a positive disposition to keep looking. But you have now encouraged me to think about whether we want to invite a further conversation here. And also, I think your example of the water tower is interesting. That's like the only thing, it's almost pristine. Like, it's not very gritty. It's kind of disappointing to me. Like, it doesn't really represent the fire at all when I look at it. So as a kind of historical marker, I mean, it's great that it's so well preserved, but it doesn't kind of have the grit of what those people in the city had to go through and endure when they rebuilt. So I'm not sure what kind of emblem I would interpret it as functioning as, but presumably one that's multifaceted, possibly in some of the ways you suggested. So thank you. You guys are giving me so many good ideas.
Jacob, you're next.
So Nia made me think of something that I've noticed. So I think society has, or at least I would like to ask if you think society has started to place a higher importance, or at least higher value on grit. And so I'll bring up some examples of that. So thrifting has become a very common thing. And so like thrifting is, in terms of fashion, a bit more fashionable than new clothing these days. And or for instance, like I tend to get more, I find people like my outfits more when it's a pair of shoes that I have had for years that are destroyed. Like people for some reason like that more than a new pair of shoes that I just got. Or like now when they're making new shoes, I've noticed some of them, the tongue of the shoe, instead of having the fabric sewn all the way around the foam of the inside of the tongue, they just let the foam hang out. So, and I guess that in a sense is like revealing how it was made. So would that be a way of them, a new value for grit or no?
A new value for it? I mean, it's a nice question whether these examples are examples of grit in the sense I was thinking. They certainly are in the text, they can be in the textural sense. I hadn't thought about the fashion cases. I think the point you were making at the beginning is some of your comment, something like the point I was making at the beginning of the presentation, where it seems like now people are saying, you know what, you can't sell your loft unless you've got some salvaged barnwood up on the wall, because there's this contemporary sort of affection for things that are older and things that are gritty looking, even though they may be faux, right? So in lots of those cases, it's not genuine, unfortunately.
Mhm.
And that also makes me think of examples in fashion that span back years. I mean, I don't think thrifting is a new thing. I suspect in, for example, the 1960s, there was a sort of large group of people who found the ability to recycle, reuse, and refurbish other clothes into sort of new forms to be more alluring than buying the thing off the shelf. In great contrast to that, in the 80s, right, we had this horrible spate of, sorry, I guess I shouldn't say horrible. We had a spate of fashion that was just about paying ridiculous amounts of money for things that were brand new, but totally ripped or acid, with jeans in particular, acid wash, made to look like they were old. So I guess one of the things I would want to say for sure in a longer treatment of this is that there's a difference for me between genuine grit that's actually a product of erosion, and these things that look like grit or might resonate with some of the same aesthetic values as grit, or just pretend to be grit. And I have to say the aesthetic story I'm telling here depends on, at least I hope it does, on a genuine past, as opposed to something that's fabricated, or something that might just be picked up because maybe retro is the thing that's interesting, not grit per se, but just sort of looking like people did when they went to Studio 54, right? And that's
Right.
So I think there would be, you'd have to go probably case by case, or clumps of cases by clumps of cases, and try to really ferret out what's going on there. But I love the idea to think about fashion and thrifting, because I hadn't done that. I was thinking about interior design, so that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Arlo.
So I know you didn't want to focus on imperfection,
That's okay.
but that's really the part that I want to ask about anyway. So I'm wondering if like what we do with the term perfection and imperfection in aesthetics is kind of similar with what we need to do with the term good in morality. So the default, if you use the word good, you're talking about morally good. And then if you're using some other kind of good, you've got to specify, you're saying, or use context or something. You're saying good for following tradition, or good for basketball strategy, or whatever, but if it's not one of those specific contexts, you're talking about morally good. I'm just wondering if something similar maybe needs to happen for perfection in aesthetics. Maybe the default should be, I don't know what it would be, but, maximizing aesthetic value, or as much aesthetic value as it could have, something like that. And then if you're using it in some other way, you need to clarify. So when people say this imperfection is an aesthetically good thing, well, they're not using the default as they're using some other context that they need to clarify. So they need to say this imperfection as in it's asymmetry, or it's failure to match the regulative ideal, or whatever. it's imperfect with respect to that. And then that creates, it makes it aesthetically better. And it would remove the ambiguity. Anyway, I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you, Arlo. Two quick thoughts. So the first is that, and I think maybe they're related to each other obliquely. The first is that I guess it never occurs to me anymore. Maybe it's been beaten out of me somehow over the years of doing philosophy, that the word good necessarily or by default signifies moral good. That I guess I understand why one might say that. I guess I always think of things as qualified by context, right? Good for, good in, good, as a kind of. And I wouldn't have thought of the term good necessarily meaning that, because I think that its use is so clarified by context so regularly to mean something else, right? This Big Mac is good, just doesn't get me in the realm of Mill and Aristotle at all, right? And of course, it's not supposed to. I think there's so many uses of the term good that wouldn't necessarily default ethically, and you wouldn't have to do much to contextualize it, that I'd have to think about whether that's the default orientation really. But let's suppose it is. I'll give you that. I just don't think there's a default orientation for aesthetic imperfection. I just don't. I think that what you have is, and that's sort of what I was trying to gesture at, what you have is a whole bunch of different standards depending on the kind of aesthetic thing you're looking at. So we'd have a whole different set of standards if we were talking about specific kinds of natural objects as natural versus, say, designed gardens, right? And another set of standards for what would count as perfection in fashion or a specific kind of fashion. And so I just, especially once you get from the art domain, which is already messy enough, and then you broaden it out and you're doing what's roughly called everyday aesthetics, where you've got everything. Now I don't think there's a default aesthetic orientation at all. I think they always have to be contextualized. So imperfect just means imperfect either for, right, if there were some specific aesthetic purpose, or in most cases there's not, if it's not a designed art object or artistic object like a sculpture for the downtown area or something. In most cases it's not a purpose, so it's just imperfect as. And this is precisely why I don't like the discussion of imperfection, because I think when I first started the paper, actually, there was a whole section on other ways we use the term in other parts of philosophy. And I didn't, in fact, get to the point you were making, but I might have gotten there someday. And I think it's vexed enough to talk about perfection, right, with respect to the ontological argument. That's difficult. But you can kind of make sense of what's going on there. And once you take it out of those kinds of contexts and you throw it into like the world, here it is, it's an environment, I just lose all grip on what a default would be. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, not really. I guess just anytime you have an imperfection being an improvement, maybe not to your ear, to my ear, it sounds paradoxical unless you explain. Yeah, it seems to me like, okay, well, then there must be two different domains here, because if it's an imperfection and we're talking about the same domain, then it's not an improvement to me. So it's like, I'm just really wanting more clarification than imperfect with respect to what, I guess, and maybe you're right. Maybe there is no default.
And so anyway. I think that's precisely why I would just drop the language of imperfection.
Yeah.
I don't think it's paradoxical. And this was the point my colleague was making the other day. Like Hamilton's use of imperfection in that jazz article. He says, look, he's just trying to make something look paradoxical that isn't. It's just that jazz has different regulative ideals from, say, classical music. And I'm like, I know, David, but I had to write the paper. So sorry, my colleague's name is also David. And so I think I'm leaning in that direction, Arlo, which is why I'm not quite sure what I would do except for just bag the imperfection talk and say, here are interesting dimensions that may resonate with and sort of enhance or improve one another. And they're worth our time. I mean, here's sort of maybe that's all I want to say. It's worth your time. You might not have thought grit was, but hey, maybe it is. And that might be like as far as I could get. And I don't, and then the conclusion would be the urbanists are just wrong to use this language, right?
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
So Renee, I'd like to take a swing at this a little bit and see what you think about it. Could it be that one way that, I know you're not liking the use of the word imperfection, but just to pursue that a little bit,
Okay.
that what one way that imperfection can enhance aesthetically, say, a work of art, would be that there are these conflicting things we want from art. How on the one hand, we want art to minimize or even eliminate the sort of randomness and messiness of ordinary life. So like if you're telling a story, you edit out the irrelevant, boring details. And you do something like that with other kinds of art as well. But it can happen that you go so far with that it violates another thing we want from art, which is a kind of human expression. So you mentioned, you spoke of acid wash jeans being horrible, coming in the 80s. What I'm thinking of in the 80s, the thing that just makes me want to vomit is drum machines, which came in the 80s. And, drum machines, they could keep the rhythm absolutely perfectly,
Yeah.
but to my ear, it sounded cold, it sounded inhuman. And lots of other people have that same reaction. And so then it seems as though we admire to a certain extent how artists are able to eliminate the messiness, the randomness of life. But if they go too far, it no longer seems like a human expression. And so those, I think, are two sort of competing aesthetic principles. So maybe a certain amount of grit maintains that human element. That's just a suggestion. I haven't really thought it through.
So I say yes to all of that. And then the question, sorry, Arlo and David, the question is, why do I have to use the word imperfection? Why can't I just say, look, there are competing regulative ideals here.
Yeah.
And we find artworks, sometimes we find them more gratifying when they really put those in tension with each other. That's actually part of what can be interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also the competing regulative ideals can generate cases where an artwork falls too far on one side or too far on the other. And then we say, oh, it's not as engaging. It's not as successful as a human expression. It's not as apt as a way of feeling our shared humanness, as opposed to the blandness of the drum machine, which just doesn't capture human rhythm. It captures artificial rhythm or something. So I like it. I think I agree. You started by saying, could we spell out imperfection this way? And I'm just wondering why I can't just junk it now.
Well, I'll just make one quick reply and then we can move on to others. I guess the reason why it might be appropriate to use the word imperfection is if someone were kind of like, go back to the drummer thing. If it's a human drummer who sort of is deliberately not quite being on the beat, that's a different thing than if they're trying to be on the beat and not quite succeeding. And so that imperfection, it seems to me, it might be a little bit different than if someone is just like some jazz drummers are deliberately not being quite on the beat. And I think that'll sound a little bit different than someone trying and failing. And the trying and failing can have its own kind of aesthetic merit. And so in that sense, it would be an imperfection. You're not able to do what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that I'm trying to figure out how I want to put the point here, David. I didn't think I was going to jettison the concept entirely until these couple of conversations. I don't think you can walk away from it fully, but I think what I would want to say of the example you're giving of a person who's attempting to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata correctly, but missing lots of notes, versus, so your drummer, right, who's trying to stay on, but isn't, versus the one who isn't concerned to stay on, right?
And mind you, it would have to be, if you're
think
if you're too far off, it's going to be terrible. So it's you know, because
Sure.
yeah.
It's a
Sorry,
very
go ahead.
bad performance, right?
Yeah,
And so I think that's what I would talk about, sort of the abilities to live up to some regulative ideal in this context, and where those abilities are evidently lacking, we say, oh, that's not as good a performance. I have a reason not to watch it. I'm trying to figure out how to keep all the stuff without actually using that term anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can do it, and so I really like both of your suggestions and your ideas. I'll have to play with them. Thank you.
Sure.
I'll have to improvise on them.
The floor is open if someone else has a question or a comment.
Well, if not, I thank you all for your really kind attention, really awesome questions and great examples. Nothing is actually kinder than people spending a little bit of time with something that you're working on and giving you new ideas. And so this has actually been a really great gift for me, and I appreciate all of you spending time with me tonight. And Arlo, it was great to see you.
Well, thank you, Renee. You gave us all quite a lot to think about as well. It was an excellent presentation, so thank you. So, and I want to echo Renee in thanking all of you for coming. And we do this kind of thing every semester. We have 2 or 3 Philosophy Matters events. This is the last one for this spring, but I hope some of you will consider coming back. Look for announcements in the fall for our Philosophy Matters series. All right, I guess we can sign off. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Renee. Take care, everybody.